Well, yeah, thanks. So yeah, so my main contribution to this group is I make lots of mistakes, so you don't have to. So that was one of them. Don't swim in the Charles for the sake of your health. Um, so during this time, I just want to help a little bit with the interpretation portion of this passage of more than we read together, but Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, that section of it. And so just to remind where we're at as a book, this book, it seems to be written to people who were likely Jewish, like every other verse, he's talking about some passage in the Old Testament. So he presumes they know a lot about that. And it talks a lot about what they would have experienced of God so far and how Jesus is so much greater than that. And so this week, the focus is kind of on how Jesus is greater than what their experience was with Moses. And there's also a sense in this book where it seems like from the context that there's things happening with believers at that time where suffering was so intense that a lot of them were considering just giving up. Like, it's too hard to follow God. Maybe I won't continue to do this. And so there's lots of moments in this book where he encourages them to stick with it and to say that God is worth it, to see this through. And so we'll see those as we look at this passage tonight. But the big idea, I'm going to give you the big idea first, and then I'll see if I can prove that to you. But kind of the big idea of this passage is that we're no better than those who failed before us, but Jesus is far greater than any other hope. Okay, so we're no better than anyone who's failed before us, but Jesus is far greater than any other hope. And so this passage talked about Jesus being better than Moses. And so, you probably don't think about Moses a whole lot throughout your day, I'm assuming, if you're like me. But if you were a Jewish person in the first century, there was no one greater than him in your mind. And so for those of you, to remind you, or for those of you that may not know, some great things about Moses that God did that God used Moses to free the Israelite people from over 400 years of slavery. It wasn't a long process. It was pretty quick. They did through Moses. He also showed all these miraculous signs and these plagues. He crushed a world empire in order to do that. God used Moses to provide food out of thin air when they were in the middle of the desert. He provided water miraculously from rocks. Through Moses, he gave them the Jewish law. He gave them the priest and the sacrificial system, their entire religious expression, including the tabernacle where they experienced God visibly. God used Moses to write the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And God said about Moses that normally with prophets, he would speak to prophets in dreams and visions, but with Moses, he spoke to him face to face, just like a friend would do. But even though God did all those things through Moses, the people that followed Moses still complained about God's provision. They still disobeyed God, either passively or defiantly. And ultimately, when it was time to enter the land that God had promised them after freeing them as slaves, instead of trusting God, the God who had proved himself faithful, they refused to trust him. And so a lot of this passage, he's referring to a lot of things, but you might have noticed some quotes in your passage. And there are several quotes he takes from a reflection written in Psalm 95. So it's a song that was written about the experience of the Israelites, called in Psalm 95. And Danica is going to read a little portion of that, the last half of Psalm 95, just to have some idea of what he's referring to that the first readers would have known already, that we might need a little backstory on. And so, Danica.
All right, Psalm 95, verse 6. Come, let us bow down and worship. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he is our God. And we are the people of his pasture, the flock under his care. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did at Meribah, as you did that day in Massah in the desert, where your fathers tested and tried me, though they had seen what I did. For 40 years I was angry with that generation. I said, they are a people whose hearts go astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest.
Thanks, Danica. And so in particular, the phrases, 2 phrases. One is, today, if you would hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. And the second one is, they shall never enter my rest. both of those phrases are repeated 3 times in the passage that we're reading. And so he keeps saying them over and over again, that he wants us to keep this in mind as we're thinking about this. And so a question that kind of comes up as you're reading this, like, how do you interpret this? One question is, how do you harden your heart? And what does that even mean, to harden your heart? It seems pretty important. So there's lots of places we can look for this, but to harden your heart, one way you do that is by ignoring God. If you sense God speaking to you and you keep not listening, that's one way to harden your heart. You can also harden your heart by relying on your own judgment when you know God's said one thing, but you choose to trust yourself. It says in this passage itself that you can harden your heart by holding on to sin that you know isn't God's ideal for you, but you cling to it and keep repeating that. You can harden your heart by allowing bitterness or a lack of forgiveness to remain without addressing it over time. You can harden your heart by clinging to comfort or ideals more than God's wisdom and care. And so, a hardened heart can't love, a hardened heart can't receive love, and a hardened heart can't trust. And a hardened heart can't truly relate to God or to anyone else. And the hard truth is that any unattended heart, a heart that you don't work on actively, always hardens. It's like if you've driven in Boston, but we drive on these horrible streets that it's like a war happened here and we never really fully recovered from it. And so there's huge potholes and your car eventually will hit something that knocks the alignment out of it. And so that your car wants to pull in one direction and not stay straight. And it takes constant correction to keep it straight. That's kind of what our hearts are like, that they're not aligned and they take constant effort and work to keep them soft, to keep them from getting hardened. So here's a problem that the author talks about in this text. The problem is that if the Israelites, the example he gives you, after seeing all that they saw, if they still harden their hearts, if they still stop trusting and were unable to enter the rest of God, then there's a real danger that we will do the same thing. And that's the problem. And so here's a question just for you guys to put in the chat. I want to hear your thoughts on that. But what are some things or some experiences or circumstances that tempt us to harden our hearts and not trust God? What do you got? Yeah, what are some things that tempt us to harden our hearts and not trust God? Church hurt, 100%, 100%. Yeah, it's unique where you've been vulnerable and you expect differently, but they're broken humans there, a lot of hurt there. Oh, go too fast for me. Hardships and success, that's really good. Yeah, true. Death, illness, loss, even ambiguous loss, that's great. Grumbling, complaining, sickness, pain, great. Yeah, oh, coronavirus, for sure. Someday we'll never say that word again, I hope. Stress, disappointments, loss. Yeah, these are so good. Yeah. I think there's one of you mentioned this, but there's like you can harden your heart by either having, like when you consider money, like I've seen people who had too much money and it caused them to harden their hearts toward God. And I've seen the opposite where they really felt like they always had nothing and they're always lacking, and that led them to harden their hearts as well. But I see a lot of holding on to dreams too tightly, where they're what they long for about their school or grades, friendships, a significant other, a job, a spouse or a child. Like they want something so badly and either don't get it or they lose what they got. And that can, if not handled carefully, can cause you to harden your heart, right? So, well, good. So another question that came up during this, like it talks a lot about the rest of God. What does it mean to not enter his rest? So this is one of those passages that makes people theologically jittery a little bit, like a little nervous, like what are we going to say here? This is a little tricky. And so here's the rub, right? Here's where this rub is. If we truly believe that there is nothing we can do to save ourselves, and if we are utterly dependent on Jesus' death and resurrection to save us, which we agree to that, and that we only have to trust him to be saved and enter his rest, then how can we be in danger of unearning something we never earned in the first place, right? Or can we really lose something God gave us by faith? So I won't satisfy any theologians in this next few moments, but I don't want to totally take away the discomfort that the author clearly intended as well. And so let me give a couple of quick thoughts, and then you can pursue me if that's not satisfactory later. But first quick thought is about the rest of God. And so when the Israelites did eventually enter the land that was promised that they were going to enter, they entered God's rest, is what it says. But it was just a foreshadowing of a much greater rest that was to come. It wasn't the total fulfillment of it. It was just like a taste of that. And as believers in Jesus, we're promised an ultimate rest with God one day that is free from all striving and all pain and all sorrow. But it also talks about a taste of that ultimate rest that's available today. It says today 5 different times in our passage that as we lean into trusting Jesus and experience relief from all of our striving and our fear, we can enter his rest now in a very real sense. So there's a couple thoughts on the rest of God. And then one other thought, just to kind of frame this to give us some parameters for it. But so some would say that in the same way that you choose to believe in Jesus, you have the freedom to choose not to believe in Jesus also. And therefore, any benefit of believing would be null and void if you did that. Others would say that if it seemed that you believed, but later it is apparent that you do not believe, then you're merely revealing that you never truly believed to begin with. And so both groups, regardless of where you land on those or somewhere in between, both groups generally agree that God is the one who saves us by faith. And I know that's a super dissatisfying answer, but only God really knows who is his. And we can see fruit, and our actions say more about what we truly believe than what we say. So one other observation in this, and then I want to give it an example to kind of help illustrate this, but you may have noticed when you're reading it that disobedience and unbelief are kind of used interchangeably. Like it will just switch to saying the opposite sometimes, and so he's meaning the same thing. They are the same thing. And so how do we know if we truly believe? So we won't ever be perfect in this, but our actions always speak louder than our words. Our actions are the fruit show what we truly believe. And so as I was praying about this passage and how to illustrate this, like I was trying to think of something from my own life that would illustrate, I say I believe one thing, but I actually do another. And God said, what about last Thursday? And I'm like, oh, well, that would be embarrassing to share about God. But, it's, I can't think of an example of failure that would be encouraging. So it's going to be embarrassing no matter what. And hopefully it'll help. And so last Thursday, let me preface it by saying this. This is going to sound weird, but I love my doctor. I have an amazing doctor. I know that sounds weird, but he's truly amazing. He's super into preventative care. He does tons of research. He's not pushy with it, but I've learned so much about rest and eating, the latest research. I've watched documentaries he's recommended. Whenever I leave his office, I literally talk about it for a few weeks, like everything we talked about. It's crazy. And I trust him. I believe what he's telling me is accurate, but my actions sometimes betray me. So last Thursday was my son's last day of 7th grade, and it's only like a half day. And so I'm taking him in, but it's like a 45-minute drive to get to his school. So it's like I'm driving 45 minutes. He'll be out in a few hours. I'm not going to drive back home and then drive back again. So I'll just, I'll roll up on a coffee shop nearby and get some work done. That was the plan, And so get him to school. He hops out, and I've got this information from my doctor about nutrition in particular and all this stuff rolling through my brain. But when my son hops out, I realized, oh my gosh, he totally forgot that his mom made him this like really tasty, really nutritious smoothie. Like he didn't touch it. We totally forgot all about it. And so I'm like, well, it's not my plan to have that smoothie this morning, but it's healthy and I hate to waste stuff. So I drank the whole thing, right? So then I roll up to this coffee shop that I found on Google Maps I'd never been to before. I go in and I start to order coffee and realize, oh, this isn't really like a Starbucks vibe. This is like a restaurant. I'm going to hang out at a restaurant for a few hours. I feel bad not ordering something. And so somehow I end up with a breakfast burrito. 20 minutes after I'd had my breakfast, right? And that, it was delicious, but that wasn't the plan either. And so I'm actually working on this passage while I'm there. I'm studying this passage. And so then it's like, oh, I need to get going to go pick up my son. But then when I look up how to get back to his school, I see, oh my gosh, there's a hot chicken place so close to me right now. And I'm never here during lunchtime in this part of the city. It'd be such a wasted opportunity if I didn't try it out, right? So I go to this hot chicken place, and it's one of those like this is kind of rude at like a not healthy restaurant, but they put like the calorie count next to everything you can order. It's like I didn't show up here because I was thinking about my health, but I see that like the calorie count for what I'm ordering is equal to what it should be for the entire day, maybe more. And I enjoyed every single calorie. But I realized that, even though I might say I really trust my doctor, my decisions reveal that what I truly value isn't always in line with my body's design for life and flourishing, right? So we do the same thing when we say we trust God, but our actions betray us by showing that what we truly trust and value are something else, right? So that's the problem. So what is the solution? And then we'll, let me give you a few things here. So it says, in the very first verse of chapter 3, it says, therefore, holy brothers and sisters who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus. Or another translation just says, consider Jesus. So what is it that makes Jesus a better hope or better than Moses? And there's three things I want to just briefly share that come from this passage to consider when you consider Jesus. And so there's three words, just so you can maybe help you hold on to it. So team, first word's team, second word is sword, and the third word is throne. Team, sword, and throne, okay? So let's start with team. So all of us have experiences and backgrounds and live in cultures that shape the way we view the world, right? It's how we understand things. We make assumptions. We have biases. And when you're reading the Bible, unless you're like super intentional, we place our assumptions and our biases on what we're reading in the Bible. And so one of them for most of us, probably growing up in a Western context anyway, is individualism. So we normally assume when we read the Bible that the commands are for me to do independently, or that when you read the word you means me. But out of like the 66 books in the Bible, all but 3 of them, I think, were written to communities, not to individuals. And every time you look at the word you, like almost every time, it doesn't mean you singular, it means you plural, right? So you all or y'all, if you wear hats like Danica and Cole do. So don't miss the implied team in this. In verse 13 of chapter 3, he says, but exhort one another every day, as long as it's called today, and none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. And so if sin is deceiving, we need each other to help see where we're being deceived. And so some questions to always be asking ourselves is, who is my team? Am I actively trying to help others keep their hearts soft? And am I actively inviting others to do the same for me? So that's the first one, team. And the second two relate a little more directly to Jesus. So the first one is sword. When you first read this section, Hebrews 4, 12 through 13, it almost seems like it's way out of context. Like, why would they put that here? Cool verses. Why are they in these chapters? But let me read that out loud to you. If you have a Bible, you can read too, but it says, for the word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing to the division of soul and of spirit, of joints and of marrow, and discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart. And no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. So the Bible, let me back up. So when we started Hebrews, it began by saying that God has spoken in many times, in many different ways. And in these last days, he has spoken through his son, right? So it calls Jesus the living God, and here it says that the Bible is living and active. It's saying that Jesus, the living God, is present in the living Word. It's truly unlike any other book that we read. And so in one sense, it's different from any other book, because when we open ourselves up to God's voice in his Word, you're not just learning about God, but you're encountering God. You're not just learning facts about him. You're not just chewing on what he's like, but he is there with you. The author of the book reads the book with you as you read it, as you meditate on it. God is present when you read this. He's living, he's active, he's present. But it's also different, and this sounds crazy if you're not familiar with this. It sounds crazy if you are familiar with it. But when you open yourself up to God's voice through his Word, you learn things about yourself that only God knows. He refers to the Bible as a two-edged sword. Most people agree that this is probably like there's a short sword that the Roman soldiers would carry. It's like about 20 inches long, and it's super sharp on both sides. This sword was designed for close combat. So when you're fighting an enemy, it was a sword sharp enough that it could pierce through the armor that protected their vital organs in close range. And so with that image in mind, it's saying that that God's Word, his voice in his Word, is so sharp and discerning that it cuts through hardened hearts and not only exposes our actions, but the thoughts and the intentions and the motivations of our hearts, things that we could never see on our own. It lays those things bare, not to humiliate us, but to heal us. And you can't heal what you haven't diagnosed. And so what do you do when your team or the sword exposes sickness in your heart? So we said a team, sword, and the last one is throne. And I'll close on this, but so chapter 4, verse 14 through 16, he says, "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." So in the ancient world, approaching a throne was a life-threatening decision. You were at the mercy of the ruler to either kill you or let you live. And most of us tend to hide from those that we are ashamed to face. It's just a natural reaction. When I do something stupid or say something stupid, as I often do, and make my kids or my wife angry, like it's my natural tendency to try to avoid close proximity for a little bit. Hopefully, like maybe they'll cool off a little bit, even though if I know it's my fault and I have to face it. I do the same thing with God when I sin against him. I do the same thing. If you remember, Adam and Eve did. Like I want to hide from God for a little bit because I'm just too ashamed to approach him. But Jesus is saying in this passage, when you know your heart is sick, the worst thing you can do is avoid the cardiologist, right? You come boldly, you come desperately, come expectantly. He says he is more compassionate than we ever imagined. So there's I put a quote in the chat just so you can read it. It's hard to just hear without seeing it, but this is from a book called Gentle and Lowly. And here's what it says about our tendency to not want to approach God because of our sin. It says, "If you are part of Christ's own body, your sins evoke the deepest heart, his compassion and pity. He's on your side. He sides with you against your sin, not against you because of your sin. He hates sin, but he loves you. We understand this when we consider the hatred a father has against a terrible disease afflicting his child. The father hates the disease while loving the child. Indeed, at some level, the presence of the disease draws out his heart to his child all the more." So the very disease and the failure we expect to push God away are what endears him to us and pleads with us to come and be healed again and again. So while we are no better than those who failed before us, Jesus is far greater than any other hope that we have. And so we want to, we're going to throw some questions in the chat again, and then we're going to send you to your breakout rooms again to discuss how we want to apply this to your lives. So, thanks.